to what he's talking about. Oh, there you go. Whether or not I know what I'm talking about, and not only whether or not I know what I'm talking about, because it's all opinions, but also where my opinions come from. So basically, although I now find myself existing within the realms of academia and wearing the heavy worsted cape, I began in magazines back in 1985. I was studying graphic design at St. Martin's School of Art. I've never studied photography on any photographic course. And in fact, the first ever academic essay I wrote was the one for my PhD. I learned photography from photographers, commissioning photographers and working with them through the 80s and 90s, primarily on Elle magazine, as I say, and then Tatler magazine as the art director for 10 years, up until 1999. Although those magazines perhaps will come with a certain preconceived ideas as to what kind of photographers work for them, I can tell you that I was commissioning and working with William Klein, Abbas, Leonard Freed, Jane Bound, Richard Avedon, Bruce Weber, Herb Ritz, as well as giving young photographers their first commissions, people like Corinne Day, Glenn Luchford, and also people like Peter Dench, for example. I gave him his first ever commission. So I learned photography from photographers, and that's where my passion developed. From there on, I had a number of roles, but I've worked as a working commissioned photographer, exhibited, published photographer. Books of my photography have also been published for the last 20 years. And I think I was also part of Photo 8 magazine, art directing Photo 8 with John Levy. Some of you may know of that title. It was pretty special on its time. And I then went on to edit magazines such as Professional Photographer for a short time before launching my own magazine, Hungry Eye. I've curated exhibitions and done all of that kind of stuff. And for the last 9 years, I continue to work as a commissioned photographer. I never use the word commercial, but as a commissioned photographer. And obviously, I now lecture on photography, write on photography. And as Alexandra said, I produce and present the weekly A Photographic Life podcast from my shed. If those of you wanted to see the shed, I'm sorry, this is my wife's office that I'm using this evening. So the talk tonight, Shooting into the Future and Missing. When Alexandra spoke to me initially, she mentioned this book, New Ways of Seeing, the Democratic Language of Photography, as a kind of a starting point. And I'm going to explain why that kind of is a starting point and isn't. But as you're the contemporary photography group, and because the brief for this talk was so broad, I wanted to kind of set some questions. And sometimes this kind of seems to argue, confuse or make photographers angry, because I like to give questions, but I'm not very good at giving answers, as you'll see. So let's kick this thing off. No, why didn't that work? Okay, so that's sometimes how I feel. Every time I kind of have an opinion or I have a thought about something, I write something, I do the podcast, I'm kind of launching myself out there, I suppose, without really having any idea of what I'm saying or what I'm doing as to where it's going to land, which is kind of how I feel tonight. I should say, I have no notes for this, as it will become apparent, I'm sure. But I have a rough idea of what I'm going to talk about and what I want to talk about and what I'd like to question you guys about, really. I suppose that idea of initiating some discussion. So that's kind of how I feel every time I do something. No safety net. But what often ends up happening is I'm like this guy. Quite often things kind of rebound on you. And when you have, or you put forward ideas that may be against a common perception or the norm, it can sometimes come back at you and it can hit you. But I don't think that's a problem. I don't have an issue with that at all. As long as that debate that we engage in around photography is rigorous and it's mutually respectful. And I think that's the really key thing, is that mutual respect, that we are dealing with opinions here. We're not dealing with facts. So quite often I'm launching myself in the air, and quite often I'm getting hit by a cannonball coming back at me. But it made me think that you're the contemporary photography group, but what is contemporary photography? And that may seem like a very straightforward thing to answer. But every week in my podcast, I ask photographers, what does photography mean to you? And I give them 5 minutes in which to answer that question as a piece of audio. And they send it to me. We're about 200, we're over 200 now, photographers from really broad range of practice. And it's intriguing to me that I don't think I've ever had a photographer who's come back and said that they had asked themselves that question before. A lot of people find that question very difficult to answer, and they don't respond. They say yes, they're going to do it, but they never do it, and I don't hear from them again.
All Photographic Society tonight?
Someone's got their microphone on. So that idea of asking a simple question is, I think, relevant to everything that we do. And quite often we don't ask ourselves those simple questions. So that's where I'm going to start this evening. So I'm going to ask, is it this? Is this contemporary photography? It's a photograph from a food magazine from this month. So therefore, it is contemporary. It is of our time. It's very obviously not 1970s food photography or 1980s or prior to that, because that photography had a look to it. It had a way of being produced, whether it be analog rather than digital, or the styling and the way in which we feel that the cake can be presented, that it's been cut into, that the icing is dripping off. In the past, that may not have been considered to be appropriate or professional. So I'm going to put forward these ideas as to, is this contemporary photography? Or is this contemporary photography? A deconstructed image of food, a photograph that isn't trying to be of food, but is of food. I think that's saffron, some crackers, maybe some fish or something on the plate. So is that contemporary photography? Or is it this? Is this where we are now with photography, with the ape guys and that whole building up around that idea? Now, we may say that, of course, it isn't photography. It wasn't created by a camera. Nobody pressed a shutter. But it's digital visual imagery. It's visual storytelling, visual image making. So does that then make it photography? Or this? Is the metaverse photography? Is the metaverse contemporary photography? The NFT is a very contentious area, but there's no doubt that a lot of the big players are chucking their money into it. And a lot of photographers were getting very excited about it and are now getting a lot less excited about it. But the idea of the metaverse as this virtual world in which we're going to live and we're going to shop is going to require visual image makers to create it. In fact, I saw a job today for somebody to create imagery within the metaverse. So I wonder if that's photography. Is this photography? AI, VR. Are these areas where photography will be sitting? Will this be contemporary photography? The things that NFTs and AI and VR and so forth, the metaverse, are contemporary concepts. They're about now, and they're also about the future, about where we're going. So is this something that we should be looking at? So what about this? This recent Leonardo da Vinci exhibition. I think they did something similar for Van Gogh as well. Is this photography? And also, is this contemporary photography? It's a contemporary form of exhibition, and it's visual, and it's using light, and it's using digital. So elements from photography that we are quite happy to accept, they feed in to these areas. But does it have to be this? Does photography have to sit in a beautiful book? Does it have to finish up as an artifact on a bookshelf? Does contemporary photography have to be published by Stiegel or by Mac or any other publisher? Does it have to be controlled by the artist, by the photographer? Does a photographer have to call themselves an artist to create contemporary work? Or does it have to be seen here at Photo London? Does that then identify that work as being important? Or does it just put it into a position whereby somebody thinks they can sell it, that it goes into the art market, which feeds back to that idea of the NFTs and the idea of marketing and selling? Now, I don't refer to photography as commercial, because in my mind, another contentious standpoint, but I stick by it, all photography is commercial. That then goes through a process of a commercial transaction at some point. Now, that may be work that goes through as a print and it's sold as a print. It might be sold as a book. A commercial transaction has occurred. It's not commissioned because it might be self-initiated, which obviously a lot of contemporary art practice comes from that point, that place. But to not think of Photo London and that marketplace as being a retail environment is to really misunderstand the idea of buying and selling photography. I should say I also worked at Sotheby's for a while. And when I was there, there were two Gurskys framed in an office I was in, two different size Andres Gurskys, just leaning on the floor at the side of a desk. And I said to the expert, there's not a lot of experts in some ways in Sotheby's. There are some experts, but the main job is to try and get the stuff sold. And I said to the guy, you know, why is that one more expensive than that one? And he looked at me incredulously and said, well, that one's bigger. That was the logic behind that. So that's the straightforward commercial environment. So does photography have to exist within Photo London to be important contemporary practice? Is that its only outlet? So what that leads me to thinking is, well, you know, what is photography and what is a camera? And I don't think we seem able to decide upon that as a photographic community. Is that a camera? The Hollywood in your pocket? The iPhone? I recently bought, in fact, only yesterday, a new phone, a Google Pixel 6. Supposedly the best camera, according to their advertising. But just as this iPhone and just as that Pixel 6 are promoted as cameras, that's the only reason for getting them, for upgrading. In effect, what we're being sold is a camera. They all ring the same, they all do text messages, they all get onto social media, they'd all do those things the same. But they've got to come up with a reason for us to buy them. And the reason for the last few years or so has been the camera. But of course, what that then takes us into is not digital photography, but computational photography. And there's one area which I talk about a little, and I write about a little, that I can guarantee that all photographers are not interested in, because I have the figures to show that when I put something up about computational photography, people don't read it. But computational photography is the key, and the algorithms that are being built into these phones. That's the key to where contemporary photography is, because the smartphone is now the go-to camera for most people. So in a sense, the smartphone is the most democratic and contemporary camera that we could use. Or does it have to, do we have to go back to analog? Do we have to think that photography is only photography if it is created on a large format camera? Do we have to go back to those processes? By doing that, are we negating where photography is moving to? And it's moving there because of technological evolution. And that has always been the case with photography. Technological evolution has always led the image making. It's always allowed the image maker to progress their creativity and try different things in different ways and different angles. And today, of course, not only does our smartphone and our digital camera, our mirrorless or our DSLR, they not only make still images, but they also make moving images, which is another area I always joke about. What's the button on your camera that photographers never press? And of course, it's film, because it feels as if, well, film's something else. But film's a fantastically contemporary storytelling medium. So what is contemporary photography? Is it this? It's a camera and a lens. But it's the Sigma 16 28mm f2.8 DN contemporary. That's a contemporary lens. I know it's a contemporary lens because Sigma have called it a contemporary lens. I don't know why they called it that. I'm not the kind of guy who's really into kit and so forth. But I thought that was kind of interesting, that a manufacturer feels the need to call it contemporary. But surely all of their lenses are contemporary, because all of their lenses have been produced recently. So is it fact or fiction? Or is it everything in between? Maybe this is one of the problems we have with photography, that hang up about, is it truth? For me, photography is history. Each time we're making an image, we're making a historical document. That may be a factual document, or it might be a fiction-based document. So perhaps photography today and contemporary photography can embrace all of these areas. But maybe contemporary photography has always been able to do that, which makes me think, well, is contemporary photography defined by its age? Is that what makes it contemporary? But does it need a camera? And is this exciting? Is this an exciting point that we've reached? That we now have tools which allow us to do pretty much whatever we want to do. We don't have to worry about buying film and getting it processed and having a darkroom. We can have the camera in our pocket, which is also our smartphone, which allows us to immediately disseminate images through social media channels, as long as we're not searching for likes. So really, whether it's exciting or not, I think really comes down to the fact of what is our expectation. What is our expectation of photography? What is the expectation of our personal practice? Where do we think it's going to take us? And not only that, but is it going to fit into a genre? And why do we want it to fit into a genre? Who sets those rules as to whether or not one thing is contemporary and one thing is not? Is that divisive, if I can say it correctly? Is that causing trouble? Is this a situation where people are wearing different scarves for their different teams and fighting against each other because one set of work isn't perceived to be the same as another set of work. But how do we know that unless we know what a particular area of work is? But as we know, all work jumps from one area to another. We could say that contemporary practice is contemporary art practice, perhaps. But then that would be to deny the fact that many photographers whose work appears in galleries and in monographs and different kind of art books are also accepting commissions for frozen food companies, which they are. I'm happy to give names. So is that confusing? I think it is. I think it is confusing if you're constantly trying to find definitions for things, that you're trying to label work that's being created as being one thing or another thing. This is the discussion I often have about art. I don't call photographers artists, and I very rarely call photography art. The reason for this is because I try and avoid those kinds of definitions. We can all agree on what a table is or what a chair is. We can all agree that this is a glass of water. But the reality is that there are there's two things I always use as metaphors for this, but I'm sure you could find many others. Can we agree what love is? Or can we agree what art is? Or is art in the eye of the beholder? Do we need to put that label on work to make it more important? Do we need to put a label on that work to put it into a gallery or to put it into an auction? Well, of course not. Any art auction will be filled with work that was previously commissioned by magazines in particular, as well as work that may have been self-initiated. But does all that matter? Well, to some people, it really does seem to matter. I think that some of the most heated arguments I've got involved with are over whether or not photography is art or photographer or artist or so forth, which to me just seems completely nuts. I don't think we should worry about those labels. I say it seems to. But I think the reality is that none of us have an answer for this or have any answers. I've given an awful lot of questions, and I think everybody can come up with their own answers and maybe come up with their own questions to my questions. Going back to that image here, it seems to me that when people get most angry with something that I've written is when I've put questions, but I haven't given any answers. But surely it's more important to find your own answers, whatever they may be. That's how I feel sometimes. The guy who went off Niagara Falls in a barrel. I think in a way that's where we all are with photography. We shouldn't be trying to control that journey, trying to get to somewhere in particular. We just kind of have to roll with the punches. I often say to my students that photography is not about 2 and 2 makes 4. To me, photography, 2 and 2 makes whatever you want it to make. It's completely up to you. You set your own context. You set your own expectations, and therefore you know whether or not you are meeting them or succeeding in that journey. And sometimes it does feel as if you're going off Niagara Falls because you can feel as if you're out of control. And I think that's a really good place to be. I think it's good to head for the choppy waters because that's where the fun is. I always like to have an element of chaos in everything I do. It kind of keeps that sense of edge, not trying to be too controlled, not worrying about failure, not having a fear of failure. Maybe that's what contemporary photography is about. Maybe contemporary photography is about going off the edge of that waterfall without a knowledge of where photography is going to take you. It's not about trying to recreate what you've seen or necessarily following any rules. Maybe that's what contemporary photography is about. As I said at the beginning of this talk, I wrote a book, that book there. New Ways of Seeing the Democratic Language of Photography. And I wrote the book on the basis of the short little articles I write, and I post at unitednationsofphotography.com with some new thinking as well. What I was noticing was that there was a lot of talk still about what was better, analog or digital. And I found that strange because personally, I haven't shot analog film since 2006. And now here we are, when I wrote the book, 2017 or so. So over 10 years later, and 9 years since moving image was available on cameras, still this discussion was going on around analog and digital. I didn't understand it. As a commission photographer, I shot analog all of the time until 2006. Then I moved on to digital because the client expectation was that I did that. What it then did was it freed me up to do a lot more personal work because I didn't have to make those investments in film and processing and so forth. So I wrote this book, New Ways of Seeing, as I say, which to me now feels like ancient history. I wrote it in, I think, 2016, and it was published in 2018. When I took on the project, I said to the publishers, if I write this in 2016, I need to get it out and on sale by the end of 2016 because things will change and this book will go out of date very quickly. So 2 years for me was too long. But actually, as I said at the beginning, I'm shooting but missing. I was wrong. A lot of the things I've said in that book, I thought by now would be accepted and we would be moving on from there. But actually, it doesn't seem to be the case. I still see people posting photographs and saying it was taken on their smartphone, as if that needs to be said to try and, just couch the idea that it's just a snap because it was on a phone. It doesn't matter to me whether it was taken with a phone or a camera. It just doesn't matter. I'm interested in the image, the context and what the person is trying to say, not the camera that the image was made with. So 4 years later, and I have no answers. I'm no further forward, but I'm constantly questioning and trying to find suggestions for where photography could be going or where it's going today. I think at the beginning of this talk, when I was talking about what is contemporary photography and what is a camera, those kinds of conversations and questions, I really thought by now would have been answered and we would have moved on. But for some reason, it doesn't seem to be the case. Alexandra said at the beginning of this talk that I made a film, and she's absolutely right. We made a film, Do Not Bend, The Photographic Life of Bill J. Some of you may have read Bill J, his writings, seen his books. Some of you may have seen the film. What was interesting to me was how I came across Bill J was that when I took on Professional Photographer magazine, it was full of wedding photography and event photography and Photoshop and camera reviews. And that wasn't the photography I knew. And so I got rid of them all. And I removed all of them from the magazine. Very shortly afterwards, I got a letter from a guy called Joe Partridge. Again, some of you may know Joe. He did a great program in the 1970s on photography, introducing learner beginner photographers, amateur photographers, to some of the great names of photography. Bill said, I love what you've done with the magazine, but they'll never let you keep doing it. They'll stop you. You know what happened to Bill J. and creative camera. I had no idea what happened to Bill J or creative camera. It was kind of pre that time when everybody Googled everything immediately. I found out that Bill J had something to do with photography. I didn't know anything more than that, and I knew that he died. Fast forward until I think about 2017, about 7 years later, I wrote an article for the United Nations of Photography, and an academic sent me a Facebook message. He said, "You are Bill J. You need to read Occam's Razor." So I thought, well, that's kind of strange because that's the second person who's aligned me with Bill J. I think it's time I looked into this. So the first thing I did was I bought Occam's Razor on eBay. And what I found in reading what Bill said about photography was that it was exactly the same as about how I felt about photography, but he wrote about it in a very simple, easy to understand way. And that appealed to me because despite being a doctor or what have you and lecturing, I'm not an academic. I exist within the world of academia, but I do not classify myself as an academic. And neither did Bill. And Bill came from a very similar background to myself. And the moment I read Occam's Razor, I started to buy all of his books on eBay. I started to buy every copy of Creative Camera I could get my hands on between 1964 and the end of 1969 when he left, and Album magazine, which he then launched, his own magazine, very similar to the way in which I launched Hungry Eye. And what I found was that Bill was talking about the same things that I was talking about. And here we have a quote that Bill said in the December 1968 issue of Creative Camera: "There is an unhealthy trend in contemporary photography." But what was Bill talking about as contemporary photography then? And what are we talking about with contemporary photography in 2022? That's a huge 54 years. I worked that out there basically because I was born in 1964, so I just took 4 years off my age. But 54 years ago, Bill was talking about a problem, a trend in contemporary photography. So is contemporary only of the moment? Is that what we're talking about? Is the contemporary photography that Bill was talking about in 1968 the same contemporary photography that we're talking about in 2022? Or is it different? I don't really know. I'm not going to give answers. What I do think was really interesting, that problem, that trend that Bill was talking about, was a trend that he had seen at that time of creating what we would, I suppose, consider to be street photographs now, documentary photographs of people on the street extremely close up, which were very unflattering of the person being photographed. And only over the last couple of weeks, there's been more talk online once again about Bruce Gilden's pictures of the Midlands. I have my own opinions on that work, but I never talk about what I feel or think about specific photographers' work. I always keep that to myself most of the time. But exactly what was being spoken about then is being spoken about now. But surely the conversation should have moved on. But maybe it hasn't. Or does contemporary photography have to break rules? Is that the basis of contemporary photography? That idea of that trend that Bill was responding to, or that idea of photography in the Bruce Gilden style, is that good? Is that contemporary because it breaks rules? Is that food photograph at the beginning there, which I think was an Eggleston, but I'm not certain if it's Stephen Shaw or Eggleston. But is it contemporary because it was by those photographers and it breaks all of the rules of what constitutes food photography that makes it contemporary? So I apologize for having so many questions, and I apologize for having so few answers. I'm not Einstein. I can't come up with this stuff. But sometimes it's quite difficult to ask questions, and it's quite easy to come up with answers if the answers that you come up with are the answers that have always been there, that we rely on those answers. I recently wrote an article about the idea that we needed new people to read and to put ideas forward for us. That it was okay to have Sontag and Barthes and John Berger. And I'm a big fan of John Berger's in particular. But they were talking about photography as Bill was talking about photography in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and so forth. And a lot of that writing now can be incredibly academic and dense and very hard to work your way through. Whether that's deliberately so, I think, again, that's open for discussion. But for me, coming from a magazine background in exactly the same way that Bill did, what's important for me is to get a message over clearly to an audience, as broad an audience as possible. So I wonder if contemporary photography is doing that. I wonder if it's perceived to being challenging. And if it isn't challenging, is it contemporary practice? For me, what is interesting is the evolution of photography as a visual language. And I think that's contemporary. Because language is always evolving, language is always changing. And rather than getting hung up around subject matter or aesthetics or a particular approach or that word style, which is always transitory, perhaps what we're talking about here is photography as a visual language. And that narratives are constructed through work, or bodies of work are constructed through images which come together like words, like paragraphs, like sentences, which then aligns the idea of photographic practice much closer to the idea of the novelist, the poet, the musician, the balladeer. So it ties what is contemporary to something that is eternal, the idea of that storytelling. And that storytelling that could come from many different perspectives, from the generality to the specific. I think if we look at it that way, if we look at contemporary photography as being the development of a visual language, then I think it has a relevance, which is easy for people to understand. I think that's where I am. But I'm not sure. And I'm sure that every person listening this evening will have their own ideas. And perhaps some of the things I've said are highly contentious, and perhaps some of them aren't. I don't know. They're just my opinions. And that's all they are. They're just opinions. They're just questions. They're starting points for rigorous discussion and debate. And I hope once I finish this quite shortly, that we can actually engage in some of that discussion and that debate around some of those points. I'm sure we won't agree, and that's how it should be. There's a great quote I heard the other day, that if you find 6 people, or if you find somebody and you agree with them 6 times, you should vote for them. If you agree with them 12 times, you probably need psychiatric help. So I really don't expect you to agree with me, and I really prefer you didn't. But if we can try and progress that debate and that discussion, I think there's always good learning in there. So as I said, these discussions are what I have on a weekly basis on UnitedNationsOfPhotography.com, on the Photographic Life podcast, and on those social media platforms. I think that's about all I've got to say for this evening. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it's made some kind of sense. And if it hasn't, and if you haven't, then I apologize.
Thank you for that, Grant. That's just as amazing as I expected it to be.
Yep.
I'm going to hand over now to Sean, who's our question master. and Sean's been collecting questions along the way. So, Sean?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me? Is that okay?
I can't hear anything.
Oh, joy. Can you guys hear me?
I can't hear anything. Why can't I hear anything?
Yes, I can hear you quite clearly.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Zoom doesn't play nice sometimes with my sound system. Never mind. Right, so here we go. So we had a question from Phil, and which was, could you say that contemporary is more about the image produced rather than a tool to produce an image?
I apologize. I couldn't hear for a moment there, but I'm back in the room. I do apologize.
Did you get my question there, Grant? I can ask you.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry.
No worries. So Phil asked, could you say that contemporary is more about the image produced rather than the tool used to produce the image?
Well, it's absolutely got nothing to do with the tool used to produce the image. I don't think photography's got anything to do with that, to be honest with you. It's always about the bigger picture and it's about the image. But I think that's the big question, really, is, you know, do we even, what is contemporary? Well, you are the contemporary group. So,
indeed, we've got, there's a very simple sort of starting place, which obviously is open to massive amounts of interpretation. And we'll often say it has to be photography about something, not of something.
Isn't all photography about something?
That's why we're flexible.
I think that's the perfect way to be. That makes sense.
And I certainly picked up on one of the comments you made earlier about, you know, let's say the tool of choice for most people taking pictures today, the smartphone. It was actually Paul Hill, who was essentially the founder of our contemporary group in the RPS. He now exclusively uses his iPhone to take his images, nothing else.
Yeah, well, you know, I know Paul, and you know, Paul appeared in our Bill J film, and I often, in fact, Paul was my examiner on my PhD. Yeah, you know, I don't think it matters, you know, what you use. Well, and I don't think it even matters that Paul uses a smartphone, to be honest with you. I mean, when I did this book, all of the photographs in it are all taken on a smartphone. You know, everything in there, but not for any great reason. And I don't even say it. I think we should move on past that. That it's even a thing.
Yeah, yeah. So let's try. Well, Patricia asked a question about, is the Bill J film still available? Of course, Robert's given us a YouTube link in the chat already. So really enjoyable film. So thanks for putting that together.
No, that's an absolute pleasure. And I think the Bill J film's an interesting product in that it was completely self-funded. It didn't cost us more than 500 quid. Two of us did it. We used Skype for filming people in LA and in Arizona because we didn't have the money. In fact, the only money we spent was going over the Welsh Bridge to see David Hearn. So it just goes to show it was shot on DSLRs and also Canon C series. So it was a real mixture from high-end cameras and microphones to recording through Skype. So, you know, it just goes to show, actually, I think that's contemporary, is that idea of you just telling stories, but using whatever is available to you now that you can actually do that.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So Lucy asked a question, to see if I can get this right. It's perhaps more of a statement than a question, saying that all of the categories are useful ways of cataloging, but are constructions rather than facts. I guess this is relating to when we were talking about the idea of photography as history and having viewpoints. And perhaps agrees with us. So contemporary is by its nature mutable. What was once rule breaking is now normalized. Is a fair thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm Yeah, I suppose so. I think I'm always against the idea of labels. I find it's very interesting teaching students. Quite often they'll come to me and say, I am a portrait photographer, or I am a, and I'm like, no, just be a photographer. You know, that portrait might consist of something other than someone looking at a camera.
Indeed, yes.
You know, so I think it's about being open-minded, really, and really, I suppose, you know, pushing that that whole process forward. I mean, interestingly, it was Bill Jay that introduced Paul Hill to teaching. You know, so Bill was that fantastic kind of person of introducing people to different places and so forth, and doing that and being open-minded to that. And I think that's something which is really valuable.
Agree. Yeah, so much we get caught up. I think Lucy's asked, mentioned a follow-up here, thinking that we get caught up in trying to define genres as if they're real or facts. They're merely constructs. So what do we think about that?
I completely agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yay. Yeah, no, I completely agree. You know, but why would you want to put a label on yourself?
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, I'm a huge fan of Bob Dylan, you know, and try putting a label on Bob Dylan.
Yeah, you'd struggle.
You know, he's my kind of he's the person. I follow what he does. I don't follow any photographers. You know, don't try and please the audience. Do what you think is right, and really explore and take risks.
So perhaps coming back to that idea of I'm a portrait photographer, do you think that it's necessary to specialize? You know, the industry or photography industry seems to be full of people who say, this is my thing. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, because you won't get commissioned if you don't.
Yeah.
You know, what I always say to my students as well, and I set up the course at Oxford Brookes. I lead the course. I'm the subject coordinator, but also we've just had our first graduates. They'd never had photography at Oxford Brookes before. And the premise behind the course, which is deliberately set up to be unique, is that from the first day you arrive, you can photograph whatever you want. You will never have a lecturer telling you what to photograph. You document your passions and your interests from the first day. So if you want to spend 3 years photographing skateboarding, you can do that, if that's what your passion is. And that's the premise of the course. I think one of my students was coming on the thing. I don't know. Laura, are you there? I don't know if she's there. No, I don't think she is there. I was going to ask her what she thought. But so that's the premise of that. Now, my belief is, and this is from years and years of being an art director, is that I used to get people coming to me and saying, commission me. And they'd have a photograph of a wine bottle, a boxer, and a ballerina, because that was like rough and smooth. And then I used to see these portfolios. We would joke about how we would see the same pictures again and again. And I would have to say to the person, you're not commissionable. And they would say, yeah, but my lecturer really likes this picture and I got really good grades. And I said, yeah, but that doesn't make you commissionable. You're only ever going to be commissioned to take the photograph you've already taken. That person needs to trust you and make a financial commitment to you. And therefore, you need to show them what they're going to get. That's how it works. And when you leave university, you need to be specialist at a really small thing. If you are the person who photographs poets and you photograph poets better than anybody else, if you go to a newspaper or a magazine and the first time they get a poet, they'll go, let's get the poet person, because they did great pictures of poets. Now, as your practice evolves over the years, that can grow and that can develop. But the majority of photographic courses create or aim to create generalists, making sure that they've learned everything, they could do a bit of everything. But I don't want an odd job man. I want a specialist. I don't want a plumber to do my carpentry. I want a really good carpenter. So from a teaching perspective, when you're teaching 18, 19, 20-year-olds, my aim is to get them to leave and be really, really good, the best at doing something. And then over time, that can evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
I think that's answered lots of questions.
It's probably caused more trouble.
No, there's a flurry of questions that are coming in related to this around, yes, the need to specialize for getting commissions, and it's clear, in all industries, those of us who specialize get work. Yeah,
and it's very, photographers hate me saying this. This is when I put my art director hat, but you get commissioned 80% on who you are and 20% on your photography. Mm-hmm. That photography's just got to be really good. So, I get commissioned all of the time still, and I get commissioned to photograph people who increasingly, I only do people I really am interested in, but I do a lot of people I do novelists and artists and designers and people that I can sit down with and have a really good conversation. And the person commissioning me knows that if I get sent out to do those people, or actors or actresses, if I get out to do those people, they can trust me. I'm a representative of that brand. I should also say my wife is the editor of an interiors magazine, and she doesn't commission me.
Has to avoid favoritism.
Yeah.
Clear. But yeah, Patricia has made a great comment here about this is central to our contemporary group philosophy. It's not a genre. We can be about anything. You can do things in contemporary work, which is about sports, about portraits, and really convey a narrative is the important thing. I think that's a good point, Patricia.
Yeah, and I think it's the key thing. Visual storytelling, it's the basis to me of photography. I think what's difficult is sometimes some labels are interpreted differently by others. Mm-hmm. And I think that's that can be a challenge.
We've got a question here. Well, we've got a couple of comments which are carrying on the theme, really. So from Zoe, I was always told to narrow my photography interests in my old university. Very refreshing to hear this. Okay. And then J.R. Anderson. So J.R., it used to be said that amateurs are generalists and professionals are specialists. So do young photographers have to begin their photographic life with their eye on a particular specialism?
Well, no, because for me, the specialism comes from the passion. If you're, I was talking to a guy this morning who wants to come on our course, and, he's pretty much a national level.
I've sat now on, and now I can't see me mileage thing in the middle.
Hello, can you mute your microphone, please?
I sat there was on the window. I know, but you've had on me dash. I've got two clocks, right, and in the middle there was another one, and it told you if the seat belts were up.
Alexander, can you find the right?
Yeah, I'm looking.
Yeah, I think someone's lost.
Car going up the road.
Oh, I don't know how to do this.
So find the name of the person who's speaking. So Dave Caldwell, and click it, and then a little blue mute label will appear.
Let's say Dave Caldwell.
Yeah, listen to a podcast.
Yeah, Dave Caldwell, can you put yourself on mute, please? There we go.
Okay.
So
what I was just saying was that actually a different version on that is that I've got 3 photographers joining me in September, 17, 18-year-olds who are already obsessed with motor racing and are already out on motor racing tracks doing that because that's their passion. So I think quite often the mistake that people make is that They think that whether or not you're a food, you can't be a food photographer. I always say, what's more important to a food photographer? A passion for food or a passion for photography? And of course it's food. It has to be food, because food is your subject matter. You've got to understand that food. You've got to be able to work with that food. And you've got to, so it's exactly the same with anything else. So I work with the students to identify their passions and their interests, and the passions of the interests are what become the subject matter. So yes, it is very specialist, but it's very specialist based on the passion.
Yeah, that's very clear. Let's see if there's any more questions. JR asked another question. I'm not quite sure about our sat navs photography. Oh yes, that's about our.
Yeah, sat navs. Do you know what? Sat navs are photography, and I spoke about on the podcast the other week a photographer in London who has been working on a project on Google Maps, and she's been screen grabbing. So it's travel photography without traveling.
Yeah, I've seen a few things like that in the past. Yes, interesting way of putting imagery together.
Yeah, I think everybody here has got to start work on a sat nav project.
Yeah, but the thing about the technology is driving, I think, capability. You know, the ability now to use a phone that's no weight to carry in your pocket, don't need a tripod, can hold it, take a picture in the dark. So we can take our storytelling pictures anywhere we like. Also, you don't get stopped by somebody saying, "Oh, what are you taking pictures of?" Because it's a small and discreet device. So I think the technology is helping us.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting how many people still will say it's not a proper photograph because it was on my camera. It was, it was on my phone. It wasn't on camera. So it's not a proper photograph. It's like, it's amazing how many people I say, well, do you have Instagram? Yeah. Well, I'd like to look at your photography on Instagram, but that's not my photography. It's like, well, what is it then? Because without photography, Instagram doesn't exist. But there are these kind of very strange hangovers from the past that seem to define current thinking. And I suppose if I do anything, it's try and challenge some of those preconceived ideas.
That's good. Thank you for doing that.
That's all right. Someone's got to do it.
I guess Michael here is more of a comment really than a question, but it's a challenging time for young photographers. Perhaps I'll throw in one of my own comments here. Yes, I'm an amateur photographer. I might sell the odd picture. Does it put bread on the table? Hell no. So it must be really challenging for people coming out of degrees into photography to get good work.
All my students are employed from this year.
Excellent.
And the reason for that is because I don't try and teach, I don't try and train photographers. What I basically do is, my premise is to teach photography as a visual language. And that's what I was saying there. So as a visual language, it has huge transferable skills into multiple areas within creative industries and all forms of communication. So for me, I may well find that students will get into the second year of the course and decide they don't want to be a photographer. For me, that's a success, it's not a failure. It means that they've identified what their relationship is going to be with the medium. But I always say also that every single decision that we make in our life is informed by photography. What we buy, what we eat, where we live, the car we drive, the film we go and see, everything is informed by photography. And during COVID, when everybody suddenly had to buy things online, there wasn't even an opportunity to lift something up or to feel it or get, it had to be the photograph. So it's become this dominant global language. And therefore, as somebody training and learning and understanding that language, that is the most powerful employability skill. So that's another reason for not trying to teach in the old ways. As I said, I didn't study photography, I studied graphics, but we didn't have any lecturers, we didn't have any modules, we didn't have any seminars, we didn't have anything. But on my course, in my year was Miles Aldridge and Mark Matter. In the year below me was Jake Chesham and Platon. So a lot of photographers came from that course in that time in the early 80s, because we just did it.
Yeah. Comment. Yeah, Alexander's own comment here. Yes, the trail cameras. I've got one of those. It's really hard to work with, isn't it? So trail cams were not considered to be legitimate game. I think you mean cameras, but it still takes the skill to get them set up in the right place so they can function. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I did this talk the other day. If anybody wants to hear me wittering on anymore, I did a talk the other day for a guy called Neil James, who does a thing called Photography Daily. And you go for a walk, and it's about an hour and a half long interview. And I was taking some, he asked if I would take some pictures on the way, which I did. And he said, well, you're not even looking in the camera, and you haven't even got your camera anywhere near your face. And I said, well, no, I've got no intention of looking through the camera because I don't want to control the image, you know, which goes back to working with a Hasselblad, really. And you know, having it at waist level and looking at the person in the eye and not worrying about the framing of the image. So I just don't get hung up on stuff. That's my mantra.
I think that's a good mantra to have, and perhaps a good place to say thank you very much for this evening's conversation. And it's nice to see the face, because I occasionally I'm guilty of listening to the UNP podcasts from time to time. So been good.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. I do tend to keep in the shadows. It's very rare. I am giving a talk at the RPS at their 2-day seminar on photography since 1972. If anybody's interested, I'll be talking about Bill J. Tony Ray Jones going to New York in 1968, and how the contemporary photography and so forth that is considered to begin in 72 in the UK didn't. It began in 68. And so I'll be giving a talk about that if anybody's interested. And you can get daily photography daily, if you want to hear any more witterings of me, and you can see hear about the shed as well. He came and saw the shed. I hope people have enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. The comments coming in, Grant, are just saying how amazing it's been. I took a quick 2 minutes just to find out the required reading that I was given at uni, because you said you were interested.
Yeah.
And it was Professional Photography, the New Global Landscape. And specifically, they asked us to read chapter 4, The Power of the Personal Project, which of course is very apposite for those of us who've done or are doing distinctions. But there you go, that was required reading.
Oh God, that's so old now. That was the first book I wrote. I couldn't even look at it now. I'd be so embarrassed. But if you're interested in the personal project, that talk I was talking about, that photo walk thing, he asks me about personal projects in there, and I give a lot more information about personal projects and how to find them and how to ensure that you don't give up on them.
Okay,
so that might be use.
Could you email me?
One of my students is here. Do you mind? Can I?
No, of course not. No, go for it.
Sophie.
Hello.
Hello, Sophie. Sophie is one of my most fantastic students. Her work is incredible. You must see Sophie Russell Jeffrey's website. There's Sophie. Were you listening to all of that, Sophie?
I unfortunately just logged on a little. I listened to the end bit, but
I was just
yes. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just talking about. We were talking about the importance of finding your passions and documenting your passions and how the course at Brookes works.
Yes.
If it's okay, can I just ask Sophie just to back up what I was saying, or not back up what I was saying?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the course was pretty much quite different to what I gather from a lot of different photographic courses, where there was just really the focus on finding something that you're passionate about before it was anything to do with the medium of photography. It was 100% free to us in the sense of subject matter, and it wasn't about having a style or anything. That sort of photographic language developed when we found what it was that we loved doing. And at first, as like young photographers, it seemed very overwhelming being asked what you're passionate about, and you're like, well, I'm not too sure. But as soon as we got it, your photographic language develops so much from that, and it doesn't feel like uni work or anything, and the projects just keep going. And I know myself and others have sort of come away from the course and just want to carry on with the storytelling. And you almost see stories in so much more, which allows you to come away from uni not just with a portfolio, but with an understanding of narrative, which is far more important than understanding almost how a camera works, because that's sometimes quite a given if you want to study photography. So I don't know if that.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sophie. It sounds as if I paid her, but I absolutely didn't. And you must check out Sophie Russell-Jeffrey. Phenomenal work.
Thank you.
Well,
Anyway, sorry, thank you for allowing me to do that.
All things being equal, if Sophie's actually checking her diary to see if she's going to join the contemporary group on the 15th of October at our face-to-face meeting in York. So
we'll be there.
Yeah. That's fantastic. That's really good to hear.
Brilliant. I should also say I'm writing an MA as well. I'm writing an online MA, which will be launched at Brookes January 2024.
Okay, that probably brings us to the end of questions and things. So once again, my heartfelt thanks for joining us, Grant.
Pleasure.
Just as much as a pleasure for me tonight as it was for me at uni. Our next talk, the next contemporary talk, is on the 18th of July. Just check my diary. Sorry, yes, the 18th of July, and we'll be welcoming Tim Beale, who's going to talk about The Right to This City, which is a body of work documenting Tim's photographic research into housing inequalities in Bath. So I hope you'll all be able to join us for that. In between whiles, thank you everybody. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Sean, for being question master. And see you all again soon.
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers. Take care.
Keep safe.